A family of 5 vanished during a mountain trip, and for weeks afterward no one knew where they had gone. At first, people believed it was nothing more than a tragic hiking accident. But only a few weeks later, rangers stumbled upon a shocking trace, something so unsettling that anyone who saw it was left shaken. That discovery raised not only questions, but also a chilling thought. Perhaps the truth hidden behind it was far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. The wind whispered across the desolate mountains. Trails disappeared into heavy mist, and jagged cliffs dissolved into the darkness. It was only the beginning of a mystery, with no answer. The missing family, known by their last name Carson, would soon become a haunting reminder to everyone who ever set foot on that mountain. They were not thrill-seekers, nor adventurers chasing danger. And yet, somehow, they had walked straight into the heart of peril. In reality, they had lived a quiet, modest life in a small town in rural Colorado. The father, Michael Carson, was a carpenter, patient and diligent, his rough hands always shaping wood with care. The mother, Elaine, was gentle, devoted to her family. Their 3 children, David, Clara, and Sophie, each carried their own light. David, the energetic eldest son who loved sports. Clara, a thoughtful teenager with a passion for books and music. And Sophie, only 7, whose laughter filled the entire house. They had set out on what was meant to be a short trip, just to breathe the crisp mountain air. But that journey was one from which they would never return. The Carsons were known in their hometown as an ordinary, loving family. Neighbors often recalled how their home glowed with warmth on summer evenings, children's laughter spilling into the yard while Michael fixed something in his workshop and Elaine watered her garden. Nothing about their lives suggested tragedy. They were not burdened by debt, not escaping turmoil, not hiding secrets at least, none that anyone ever knew. Michael, though quiet, had a steady presence, the kind of man who earned respect simply by his calm reliability. Elaine was the balance to his silence. Nurturing, social, always the one who made sure birthdays were celebrated and school projects were finished on time. Together, they gave their children the gift of stability. David, the eldest, carried a sense of responsibility beyond his years, often watching over his younger sisters with protective care. Clara, the middle child, was thoughtful and curious, a girl who seemed to live in 2 worlds, half in the present, half in the pages of the books she devoured. And Sophie, the youngest, was a spark of joy, the one who could turn even the most ordinary day into something worth remembering. To outsiders, their planned mountain trip seemed nothing unusual, just a family's weekend escape into nature. But in hindsight, every detail of their final journey became loaded with meaning, as if the mountain itself had been waiting for them. The morning of their departure was calm, the kind of day that seemed to promise nothing more than clear skies and fresh mountain air. Michael loaded the family's modest SUV with their supplies, sleeping bags, a small tent, a cooler of food, and the kind of camping gear he had relied on many times before. Elaine double-checked everything, her careful touch ensuring that nothing essential was left behind. To the children, it was exciting, an adventure that broke the rhythm of everyday life. Neighbors remembered seeing them leave that morning, waving cheerfully as the car pulled away. Nothing about their faces betrayed the slightest hint of foreboding. Yet every smile captured in that fleeting moment would later haunt those who tried to reconstruct their final hours. At first, the drive was uneventful. The paved road gave way to winding mountain routes, the kind lined with towering pines and patches of lingering mist. Sophie pressed her face against the window, pointing out the shapes she imagined in the trees. Clara scribbled in her notebook, describing the scenery as if she knew she would want to remember it. David studied the map, eager to be involved, tracing their route deeper into the forest. By mid-afternoon, the air began to change. Clouds gathered, dimming the sunlight, and a chill crept in, despite the season. The wind whistled through the canyons, carrying a hollow sound that seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Elaine, ever attentive, tried to keep the children's spirits high, but the sense of unease was impossible to ignore. They reached the trailhead by late day, where they planned to hike a few miles into the wilderness before setting camp. Other hikers later recalled seeing them 5 figures moving steadily along the path, their voices faint against the rush of the mountain wind. Nothing about them appeared unusual. A family enjoying a hike, no different from countless others. But as evening drew closer, the weather shifted again. Mist rolled down from the ridges, swallowing the trees and blurring the trail. The forest seemed to close in, branches heavy with dampness, shadows stretching unnaturally long. It was here, somewhere along that narrow path, that the Carsons were last known to have been seen. After that, silence. They did not return to their car. They did not set up camp where they had planned. The trail offered no further glimpses, no voices carried back through the fog. As if the mountain itself had drawn a curtain, hiding them from the world beyond. In later days, rangers would try to trace each step, to reconstruct the moment when an ordinary family outing turned into something inexplicable. But that evening, as the light faded and the Carsons vanished into the mist, no one could have imagined that this would be the beginning of one of the most haunting mysteries the region had ever known. When the Carsons failed to return home on schedule, concern quickly turned into dread. At first, neighbors told themselves it was nothing. Perhaps the family had decided to extend their trip by a night. Or maybe they had lost track of time in the wilderness. But as hours stretched into a full day, and the SUV remained parked at the empty trailhead, unease spread like a shadow. By the second day, Elaine's sister reported them missing. The sheriff's office mobilized a search team, and soon the mountains that had swallowed the Carsons were filled with the sound of helicopters, radios crackling, and the voices of rangers calling out names that received no reply. The initial search followed the most obvious routes. Trails were swept, campsites checked, ridges scanned from above. Search dogs were brought in, their handlers watching closely for any sign, an article of clothing, a familiar scent. For a time, the dogs pulled eagerly, noses to the ground, weaving through the brush. But then, without warning, the trail went cold. Just like that, as if the family's presence had dissolved into thin air. Rescuers pushed deeper into the forest. They found small fragments, each one raising more questions than answers. A water bottle, half buried in mud. A child's scarf caught on a low branch. A fire pit, long since gone cold, its ashes damp from mist. These discoveries suggested the Carsons had indeed pressed further into the mountains, but why they left such scattered traces was anyone's guess. The weather only made things worse. Mist thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet. The ground was slick, treacherous, and more than once a rescuer slipped dangerously close to a ledge. At night, the searchers huddled by their own campfires, whispering about the strangeness of it all. Families lost in the wilderness usually left a clearer trail. But here, everything seemed fragmented, incomplete, as though parts of the story were missing. After a week, the search expanded in scale and desperation. Volunteers from nearby towns joined, their flashlights forming thin beams of light against the endless dark. Flyers were printed with the Carson family's photos. News crews arrived, broadcasting live from the trailhead where the SUV still stood like a silent sentinel. The image of the car, untouched and waiting, became a chilling symbol of the unanswered questions. Days turned into weeks, and yet despite the manpower, despite the technology, no bodies were found, no campsite fully set, no clear path leading out. Each lead dissolved into nothing, until the searchers began to feel they were chasing ghosts. By the third week, exhaustion hung heavy. Some rangers admitted privately that they feared the mountains would never give up the family. Others refused to believe it, insisting there had to be something they were missing. But the silence of the wilderness was unrelenting. And then, just as the search teetered on the edge of abandonment, came the discovery that would change everything. A ranger stumbled upon something unexpected, something that turned the investigation from tragedy into a chilling mystery. It was the 22nd day of the search when a small team of rangers ventured into a narrow ravine, a place so overgrown and steep that it had been overlooked in earlier sweeps. The air there was heavy, colder than the surrounding forest, the mist clinging to the moss-covered rocks like a shroud. One ranger, moving ahead of the group, stopped suddenly. At first, he thought his eyes were deceiving him. Hanging from a low branch just ahead was a shoe, a child's sneaker, weather-stained but unmistakably spattered with dried blood. It dangled unnaturally, as though someone had deliberately placed it there. The sight sent a chill through the team. Carefully, the ranger removed it from the branch. The smear of darkened blood was undeniable. Not far from the tree, hidden in the undergrowth, lay something even more disturbing. Half buried in wet leaves and mud were several small fragments of bone, their pale surfaces slick with dampness. They looked fragile, almost eroded by time and moisture, yet carried the undeniable weight of human origin. One piece was jagged, another curved, as though snapped under pressure. The forest, already silent, seemed to grow even more oppressive as the rangers realized what they had stumbled upon. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the search teams. The site was cordoned off, and investigators were brought in to examine the evidence. The shoe was identified as belonging to Sophie, the youngest of the Carson children. The bones, however, told a murkier story. They were too small and incomplete to immediately determine whose they were or whether they all came from the same individual. Speculation erupted. Some believed the Carsons had been attacked by a wild animal, their remains scattered in the forest. But others questioned why a shoe would be found hanging from a branch, bloodied but intact, as if displayed. Was it a warning? A marker? Or a message from someone who knew the forest too well? Local newspapers carried the headline within hours: "Bloody shoe and bones found in Carson search." The community, already shaken, now teetered on the edge of panic. Parents clutched their children closer, hikers canceled trips into the mountains, and whispers of something sinister spread through the towns. The investigators, meanwhile, struggled to piece together what little they had. The bones were sent to a lab for analysis, though results would take weeks. The shoe was logged as evidence, its blood samples tested. Though the moisture and decay of the forest had degraded much of it, nothing conclusive emerged in the first reports, only more questions. For the rangers who had found the site, the image would not leave their minds. A lone shoe swaying gently on its branch, above the damp ground where bone fragments glistened in the half-light. It was as though the mountain had finally spoken after weeks of silence, but in a language no one could fully understand. One thing was certain: the mystery of the Carson family had just shifted from disappearance to something far darker. The discovery of the bloodied shoe and the fragments of bone shifted the Carson case from a troubling disappearance into something far more sinister. With the evidence spread across news outlets and whispered about in every corner of the community, theories began to multiply, each one darker than the last. The most immediate explanation put forward was a natural one. Some argued the family may have fallen victim to predators in the mountains. Cougars and black bears were known to roam the region, and desperate or startled animals could have attacked. The shoe, they suggested, might have been carried away by an animal and left caught in the tree. The fragments of bone, scattered and incomplete, seemed to support this. Yet even as the theory was voiced, others doubted. Predatory attacks usually left behind more obvious remains, clothing torn and strewn, larger portions of bodies. This felt different, too deliberate, too staged. Another theory was rooted in the unforgiving landscape itself. Landslides, sudden floods, and unstable cliffs were common in the area. Some believed the Carsons had been caught in such a disaster, their bodies broken apart and displaced by nature's violence. The bones could have washed down from higher ground, the shoe dislodged in the process. But again, questions lingered. If the mountain had taken them, why no further remains? Why no signs of a slide or flood during that period? The third, and most chilling possibility, was that the Carsons had not been victims of nature at all, but of another human being. The bloodied shoe hanging from a branch struck many as unnatural, almost symbolic. Too precise to be mere coincidence, investigators considered the possibility of foul play, an ambush deep within the forest, or a crime concealed under the guise of wilderness tragedy. But if there had been an attacker, who were they, and why target an ordinary family with no enemies, no debts, no reason to vanish? More unsettling theories spread among locals. Some whispered that the family had staged their own disappearance, that Michael or Elaine had harbored a secret, dragging the children into a desperate escape. Others even speculated that the shoe and bones had been planted, meant to mislead and deepen the mystery. To the searchers who had spent weeks combing the mountains, however, that seemed unlikely. No one could mistake the weight of what they had found. Yet one detail kept returning to the forefront: the silence of the forest. The way every trace of the Carsons had vanished, except for that single haunting scene. As one ranger muttered quietly to a reporter, "It's as if someone wanted us to find only that and nothing else." Theories continued to circulate, but none fit perfectly. Nature explained part of it, but not the strangeness. Animals might account for the bones, but not the deliberate placement of the shoe. And human malice raised even more questions than it answered. The Carsons were gone, and all that remained was evidence that seemed to mock every attempt at explanation. The mountains had given a glimpse of the truth, but not enough to understand it, only enough to remind everyone how terrifyingly little they really knew. Years have now passed since the Carsons vanished into the mountains, and still no answers have surfaced. The blood-stained shoe, the damp fragments of bone, those few traces remain the only evidence of what happened. Every search since then has ended in the same way: silence. The forest, vast and unyielding, keeps its secrets well. For the Carson family's relatives, the absence is unbearable. There is no closure, no gravesite to mourn, only questions that echo in the quiet hours of the night. Some cling to hope, imagining that somehow, against all odds, one or more of them survived. Others accept the grim likelihood of death, but cannot reconcile with the fact that the truth remains hidden. Grief without answers, they say, is the sharpest kind. For the rangers who walked those trails and uncovered the grisly clues, the memory lingers like a scar. They recall the oppressive mist, the unnatural silence, and that single shoe swaying gently from its branch. Some admit they feel watched whenever they return to those woods, as though the mountain itself remembers and resents their intrusion. And for those who hear the stories, second-hand residents of nearby towns, hikers who pass the abandoned trailhead, the Carson mystery serves as a warning. Nature is beautiful, yes, but it is also merciless. A single mistake, a sudden turn of weather, or something darker that cannot be named any of these, can erase even the most ordinary lives in an instant. The Carson disappearance remains unresolved, frozen in time like a haunting echo. Perhaps someday the forest will yield its truth, revealing whether the family fell to the forces of nature, to human cruelty, or to something stranger still. Until then, their absence is a wound that refuses to heal. For now, the only certainty is this: the wilderness does not forgive carelessness. To step into its depths is to gamble with forces far beyond human control. And as the Carsons' fate reminds us, one moment of trust in the mountains can cost an entire lifetime.